Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is Dennis Hale, who's a professor of political science at Boston College. He did his undergraduate work at Oberlin College and got a PhD in political science from the City University of New York in the graduate center there. And he's been teaching at Boston College since 1978. He has been the department chair there, and also has been director of undergraduate studies and of the honors program. And he does a lot of teaching in both to graduate students and to freshmen, introducing American politics and speaking on the American founding. With Mark Landy, who's also here, he's edited 2 volumes of essays by Bertrand de Jouvenel, French political philosopher, and he's written a number of articles on local government, American political thought, public administration, which have appeared in all the various important professional journals. But he's now published, just this year, a real tome, an accomplishment, a work of scholarship that it's all too rare, and he deserves to be congratulated. And the book is called "The Jury in America: Triumph and Decline." So Dennis Hale is going to say something about this book, and he'll answer any question that you raise.
I'll try. I'll try. Can you hear me? Is this working? All right. Great. This is not my normal seminar beverage, but it will have to do.
Yeah, we don't have water.
That's what I thought. The democratic paradox is easily stated. In a democracy, ruling a task requiring wisdom is open in principle to all applicants and in practice to many who are not in the least bit wise. The focus of this book and this talk is a small sample of this paradox at work, the American jury, which places some of the weightiest questions facing society into the hands of 12 people plucked from the civic mass. The jury's verdict might send defendants home or to prison or to death row, or the jury might transfer money, sometimes lots of it, from one litigant to another. Jurors may do these things well or badly, but their decisions are usually final, and in criminal cases, a jury's acquittal is always final. That such a system has lasted so long is often the subject of wonder and sometimes scorn among foreign observers of American law, but sometimes, and not only recently, among natives as well. Understanding the jury is therefore a way to understand democracy itself, with its triumphs as well as its failures. Yet in the beginning, the jury was not a democratic institution at all. It was simply a way for the English monarch to acquire vital information that only local subjects could be expected to possess. Its gradual evolution from a tool of kings to a champion of the people's rights is part of the long story of the emergence of republican institutions in England. That evolution left an important mark on Americans, persuading them that a free government was one in which the public could participate directly in the legal system as full partners of the court, even if this meant, especially if this meant, opposition to the government itself. This belief was the spark that ignited the movement for a Bill of Rights and was ultimately responsible for 3 of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In fact, from the very earliest settlements in British America, the jury had been an important political institution with many more functions than simply rendering verdicts. Colonial juries inquired into the conduct of public officials and the management of public property, and they determined fair compensation for property taken in eminent domain proceedings. They were an essential part of an evolving republican regime in which the popular voice was understood to belong in the judiciary as well as in the legislature. Indeed, the jury was often described as the lower house of the judiciary. And as state governments became more democratic, with easier suffrage and citizenship requirements, The American jury became what it was when Tocqueville encountered it, the majority vested with the right to pronounce decrees. It had also acquired by Tocqueville's time an additional purpose: educator of democratic citizens. Tocqueville's is the most famous argument along these lines, but Tocqueville was not alone in seeing both the need for such education and the possibility that jury service might be an important way to provide it. And here the jury comes close to revealing the democratic paradox in crystalline form. Only the wise are capable of judging rightly, but only those who have experience at judging can learn the wisdom that judging requires. Tocqueville was prepared to accept one of the logical conclusions of this paradox, at least in the case of civil trials, that while the jury system might not be useful for those who have lawsuits, it is very useful for those who judge them. I regard it as one of the most efficacious means society can make use of for the education of the people. To see the jury as a free school always open, that's how Tocqueville described it, implies a certain relationship between jurors and judges. Acting as Republican schoolmasters, judges often saw themselves as the senior partners in a common enterprise where both the judge and the jury are sworn to understand and apply the law together. This meant that jurors had the authority, perhaps even the duty, to find or judge the law for themselves, always with the understanding that they should pay due respect to the opinion of the court. This was not only the view of jurors, it was also the view of judges. In one of the few Supreme Court cases tried to a jury, Chief Justice John Jay, in his jury charge, had this to say. This is Georgia v. Brailsford from 1794. It may not be amiss here, gentlemen, to remind you of the good old rule that on questions of fact, it is the province of the jury. On questions of law, it is the province of the court to decide. But it must be observed that you have nevertheless a right to take upon yourselves to judge of both, and to determine the law as well as the fact in controversy. We have no doubt you will pay that respect which is due to the opinion of the court, but still, both objects are lawfully within your power of decision. Throughout the 19th century, this good old rule that jurors and judges were partners rather than rivals, and that citizens who made the law could also understand the law, was the underlying assumption guiding the conduct of civil and criminal trials in both state and federal courts. An essential part of that view, however, was the understanding that jurors would have to possess the particular qualities that make sound judgment possible. These qualities were described in state jury statutes variously as intelligence, character, reputation, integrity, or common sense. And jury commissioners were authorized to find such citizens using whatever means they thought most effective. By contrast with voting, a right available early in the century to white males with even small amounts of property and eventually no property at all, jury service was a responsibility rather than a right, a difficult responsibility on which the fate of defendants and litigants rested, making it all the more important to find those citizens who were most likely to give adequate service. Here is Tocqueville again commenting on state jury laws in the early 19th century. While the right to serve on a jury extends to everyone, the exercise of this right is not put indiscriminately in all hands. Those who are chosen are those citizens supposed by the magistrate, whose powers were extensive and quite arbitrary, to have the requisite qualities for service. It was not unusual, therefore, for a state to have more voters than jurors. One aim of these arbitrary powers was to keep from the jury those characters the lawyers sometimes refer to as pudding heads. I don't think I need to translate that, right? This phrase appears in John Adams' legal diary as early as the 1760s, a time when only males with substantial property holdings had full civic rights, meaning that even among the community's most elite members, there were some with not enough common sense to be considered truly qualified for jury service, whatever their other characteristics. One of the consequences of living in a Puritan polity is you spend a lot of time in church getting to know your neighbors, and you figure out pretty quickly who the pudding heads are. The jury that Tocqueville saw was much more democratic than the juries of colonial or revolutionary America, and the jury would become more democratic still as the barriers to service that were set by property qualifications shrank steadily and then finally disappeared. By the late 19th century, however, the belief that jury service might educate citizens had retreated in the face of questions about the competence of jurors chosen from lists that were much less gentrified than those in England and the colonies. Mark Twain captured this mood perfectly in one of his California stories. A coroner's jury, after finding that the late Buck Fanshawe has perished as the result of several possibly fatal events, including typhoid fever, arsenic poisoning, stabbing, gunshots, and a fall from a 4-story window, rules that his death was nevertheless the result of the visitation of God. What could the world do without juries? Twain asks. This dim view of the demos and its ability to judge wisely was spreading, reflecting broader doubts about the ability of Americans to perform the duties imposed by modern citizenship, doubts that became much more vocal toward the turn of the century. Lawyers and judges, once the jurors' partners, often saw themselves and were seen by jurors as the jury's adversaries. Bench, bar, and jury engaged in a three-cornered struggle for control of the courtroom, especially over the question of who could make decisions about the meaning of the law, a question settled decisively on the side of the judge by a Supreme Court ruling in 1895, which held that there had never been any room in the Constitution for the idea that a jury could reach an independent judgment on the meaning of a law, Chief Justice Jay and many other authorities notwithstanding. So as the 20th century began, defenders of the jury, and there were many, both among judges and among lawyers, looked for ways to rescue its reputation by increasing the number of jurors with the intelligence, character, and common sense that the jury statutes still defined as essential. Better juries require better jurors. This was the view of the early American Bar Association, as well as the new Conference of Senior Circuit Judges, now known as the Judicial Conference. A common explanation for the lack of better jurors was that state legislatures had been giving blanket exemptions to dozens of professions and occupations, from ministers to school teachers to doctors, just the sort of men who might be above average in education and experience and who could be expected to acquit themselves well in the jury room. The earliest demands for a more inclusive jury, therefore, were pleas to get the better sort back into the jury box. Judges and jury commissioners, meanwhile, were instructed to take a more active role in sorting jurors before they wound up in court. And in many jurisdictions, they did this by interviewing prospective jurors before they went onto the jury list, a practice that lasted well into the 20th century. But there were also questions about whether even educated jurors could understand the law, especially civil law, which at the dawn of modern business was becoming ever more complex. Can even educated citizens really understand modern finance, complex commercial disputes, or new ideas about negligence? This concern was not missing even at the founding, although it was muted. In Federalist 83, Alexander Hamilton carefully reminds readers of those nice and intricate cases, maritime insurance cases were one of the ones he mentions, that ordinary jurors, however sensible, would probably not be able to understand. In the late 19th century, however, the intricate cases seemed to be the norm rather than the exception. These doubts, in turn, were fully consistent with the broad progressive enthusiasm for centralized administration and the power of expertise to resolve disputes scientifically. Progressives of various shades were united in their desire to increase the weight of expertise in decisions and reduce the importance of popular amateur judgment. so as, in Woodrow Wilson's words, to straighten the paths of government and make its business less unbusinesslike. Better government requires better administrators, not better jurors or even better citizens. And what, after all, could be more unbusinesslike than the American jury? The result was a revolution in the federal courts, supported by progressives in both parties and by a significant chunk of the legal profession, the Congress, and the courts. A revolution that was especially important in civil cases and whose greatest achievement was the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure adopted in 1938. Because that revolution has put judges more firmly in control of what goes on in court, it has been followed by a gradual decline in the importance of the jury, an outcome that progressives anticipated even though they rarely proclaimed it openly. By the middle of the 20th century, juries were much less important in the civil and criminal courts than they had been in the past, although they were still very much with us, thanks to their protected constitutional status, a marked contrast to other common law countries where civil juries have been all but abolished and criminal juries restricted to only the most serious crimes. In the post-war era, juries seemed quaintly amateurish at best, an ancestral fetish frozen in place by the Constitution. And at their worst, narrow-minded, bigoted, and ignorant, tyranny of the majority in its worst form, a view often echoed in popular fiction. In the stage play and film 12 Angry Men, jurors are eager to convict a young man of murder and get home to their suppers. And they are stopped only by the heroic intervention of one brave man, juror number 8. The worst miscarriages of justice took place in those Southern courtrooms where justice was still subordinated to the needs of white supremacy. This phenomenon, too, made its way into the popular culture, although in To Kill a Mockingbird, the heroic Atticus Finch fails to extract a just verdict from a jury of small-town bigots. The contemporary jury has had to bear the weight of these historic suspicions and of many real-life trials gone very wrong. But in the 1960s, the jury acquired another burden. The idea that the constitutional requirement of an impartial jury might not actually be possible, after all, since the science of social psychology, not to mention other modern sciences, had demonstrated, or so it was claimed, that no one can ever be impartial. Are we not all simply prisoners of our class, gender, race, or ethnic group? Do we not all harbor biases that are so deep, this was Justice Thurgood Marshall's view, that we are not even aware of them and therefore cannot struggle to overcome them? Lawyers, however, can apparently spot them quite easily. This is a powerful trend in the social sciences. The occasion for its impact on the jury system was the congressional effort to eliminate racial bias in jury selection with a special focus on the South. So pervasive was that bias, especially in Southern courtrooms, that Congress was persuaded to eliminate all aspects of jury selection that depended upon non-objective criteria, such as our old friends' intelligence, integrity, or common sense, because these old concepts about the ideal juror would simply give racist jury commissioners an opening to continue business as usual. But the authors of the new jury law had other ambitions as well, going well beyond the defeat of racism. As Attorney General Ramsey Clark contended in Senate hearings on the Jury Selection and Service Act of 1968, concepts such as intelligence or integrity are merely code words for class bias or the preferences of the few. When we search for such qualities, are we not inviting, he said, into the process a form of discrimination that we wouldn't necessarily want? Doesn't truth emerge from a contest of perspectives rather than from an objective consideration of the evidence? Accordingly, the 1968 Jury Act, which governs jury selection in both federal and state courts now, forbids all but a few objective standards: age, residence, citizenship, lack of felony status, and lack of any impairment that might prevent satisfactory service. Whereas these had once been considered the minimum standard for jury selection, the law now declared them to be the maximum standard. The law's official understanding of jury selection was now that jury selection should not be selective, but inclusive, with the goal not of impartiality, but of representation. The possibly unintended result of this reform, although I don't think it was unintended by Attorney General Clark, was to introduce an important change into the understanding of what jurors are supposed to do. Rather than apply the law to the facts and reach a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt, juries are now expected to reflect the disparate biases present in the community from which the jury has been chosen, and out of this clash of biases will emerge somehow a consensus. This is not, of course, how judges instruct juries before they retire to deliberate. But it's the unmistakable conclusion of the theory that the jury should be chosen from a representative sample so as to include the various viewpoints in the community among those summoned to court. And it's a very common understanding in the law reviews. It is also how a number of federal judges have understood jury selection in decisions dating back to the 1930s, which quickly became the basis for a new view of jury selection masquerading as the traditional view. This new view is also the conventional wisdom in the law journals and presumably in the law schools as well. And since the 1968 Jury Act, the concern for finding good jurors has disappeared from the jury debate almost entirely and has been replaced by an obsession with finding the perfectly representative jury list. I say almost entirely because the effort to find good jurors, or at least suitable jurors, continues under different means. This was not an unanticipated development. During the Senate hearings in 1968, one witness with a famous name, William Marbury, an attorney from Baltimore, was notably prescient. Marbury found it troubling that the bill would remove all of the court's discretion over jury selection, insisting that it's not possible to find an intelligent jury by any system other than that which gives some discretion to the selectors. Without this discretion, there would be an increase in problem jurors, the pudding heads of the 18th century, who are now referred to as UFO jurors, or nullifiers. And Marbury quite shrewdly predicted where this discretion would end up, in the hands of the attorneys, who would replace the judge as the prime movers of voir dire. Marbury found this prospect of extended lawyer-driven jury selection fantastic. I can't imagine how it would work. In the first place, I don't think jurors ought to be selected by partisan people who try to get onto the jury the people they think are going to vote their way. I don't like the idea of lawyers selecting jurors. But there's general agreement among court observers that the voir dire has become more extensive, that lawyers do in fact use the process to pick or try to pick suitable jurors, and that the lawyers have acquired more control over the process than the 1938 rules had anticipated, just as Marbury predicted. And now there's a fourth player in the courtroom to help this process along: jury consultants, who offer the promise of scientific jury selection, making what was once a seat-of-the-pants folk wisdom, poor people don't like debt collectors, watch out for jurors who have cops in their family, into a very expensive and time-consuming service. Perhaps not coincidentally, the latest phase of the jury's history evokes fears that the jury is vanishing, as the number of both civil and criminal trials, jury trials, has dropped to levels below the 1960s. Jury verdicts are now a smaller percentage of case dispositions than at any time in our history. On the civil side, one reason is the rules changes that gave judges more control over case management. On the criminal side, it's the sentencing reforms that gave prosecutors more bargaining leverage to extract plea bargains. And of course, on both sides of the court, business has exploded since the 1960s and 70s, much faster than the resources available to the courts. And there's therefore an enormous pressure to just keep things moving along. Meanwhile, there are also fewer and fewer judges with the experience of managing jury trials and fewer attorneys with the experience of arguing in front of jurors. And what of the citizens themselves? Those junior partners of the Republican schoolmasters. Apparently, it does not take very long for the most advanced thinkers in the academy to make an impact on popular opinion. Many trial observers have noted that contemporary jurors have a relatively hard time processing evidence, making reasonable distinctions between what is proved and what is provisional, exercising judgment where the consequences might be harsh, or imposing their own value systems on others. Norma Thompson has described in grim detail the problems faced by a jury of well-educated citizens of New Haven, Connecticut, including a few Yale faculty members, who could not stifle their unreasonable doubts and come to a conclusion in a murder case in what turned out to be the second hung jury for that particular defendant. Yet while many fear for the jury, many others seek to know how to extend and deepen the experience of citizenship in modern states. These concerns bring us closer to the problem Tocqueville sought to understand. How can the amateurish and destructive instincts of a democratic regime be educated to a higher sense of its responsibility? Is it really possible for ordinary citizens untrained in the law to exercise the wisdom required of rulers? If so, how? Under what conditions and circumstances does the jury best serve the highest ends of a republican regime? What are the obstacles to its proper functioning? And how can those obstacles be overcome? It's my hope that this book will prompt a wider discussion of these very interesting and important questions. Thank you. Sure.
I have to run after this, so I apologize. I don't know the exact statistic, and you might know, but that unlike in other Western democracies, some of which have juries, some which don't, plea bargaining in the United States, especially in criminal cases, is enormously common. Again, it may be for less serious crimes than murder, I don't know, but it's very, very common, which means that the majority of criminal cases never see the inside of a courtroom, so they never see a jury. And I wonder how significant you think that fact is in relation to the view of juries. I only have a little bit of anecdotal knowledge of this, but I do know that in lawsuits in which there's a monetary claim that juries have awarded much more than was asked for, they tend to get in the news if they're big enough. But a friend of mine did sue a company, and it was he and everyone else was astonished that the jury gave him twice as much as than he asked for. And so you would assume that corporations would learn. Anyway, you get the gist of it. And I just,
sure.
To me, that's, if almost no cases reach a jury, then it makes juries less
It makes the jury
significant.
Yeah, essentially the jury vanishes.
Yeah.
Plea bargaining has doubled. So it used to be that 10% of prisoners would plea bargain. Now it's 20%. So I mean, most criminal defendants never went before a jury. They never went to a trial. I mean, they pleaded guilty and they got their sentence because, you know, they were guilty. I mean, they don't round up suspects at random. And a lawyer, you know, a good lawyer will tell a defendant what his odds are, and the odds are usually not very good. But still, the sentencing guidelines have given prosecutors more leverage, and so there's a lot more plea bargaining in criminal cases. There is a theory, and no one has tested this theory, that civil jurors learned that judges can reduce awards. I mean, it's not a secret, right? It's not something that most people know about, but it's quite likely to be something that a juror might try to learn about, and it's not, I think, even illegal for the juror to try to know that. It's a fact of the law. So one theory, and again, like I say, it's not tested, is that jurors are much less reluctant to make enormous awards in order to send a message because they know or suspect those awards will be reduced by the judge. That seems to have been what happened in the infamous hot coffee case, where they awarded, I can't remember the amount, it was $20 million or something, and the judge knocked it down to an unspecified amount because they had to then agree probably $500,000. But they were apparently wanted to send a message to McDonald's that they should turn the heat down on their coffee, which they did. The very next day, actually. Yeah.
This is also a question about sending a message, juries sending a message. The most famous trial in my lifetime was the O.J. Simpson trial.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if there's any case in the theory of juries at the beginning for jury nullification. If there was some thought that the community could send a message to an overly aggressive police force or tyrant.
Well, yeah.
And let people off, even though they may have thought that that person was guilty of a crime, in order to send a message to an unjust police.
The Zimmerman case is a better example, because there the question is, when is killing someone lawful self-defense? See, there was nothing in the O.J. Simpson crime that could possibly have been self-defense, right? So this is clearly first-degree murder, and the only question is, did he do it? Not what kind of a crime was it. Juries can, when in the old days they talked about juries finding the law, what they meant was the jury gets to decide, is this actually murder, or is this self-defense? And I mean, the book starts in the 12th century with the juries under the Angevins, because the king insisted only the king gets to kill somebody, unless it's literally the last second before you're about to die. Then you can pull a knife and stab your attacker. Well, jurors didn't agree with that. So the defendant would say, well, he was running away from his attacker and he tripped, or he came to a ditch. Then the jury would say, okay, yeah, so that's lawful self-defense, you're not guilty. What happened in the O.J. Simpson trial is that the jury consultants for both sides came up with the same conclusion. The worst possible juror for the prosecution, the worst juror for the prosecution and the best juror for the defense were black women, because especially black women who had been abused, because hello, they're still alive. What does that tell you? That means physical abuse is different from murder. Just because somebody abuses you doesn't mean he's going to kill you. Well, the prosecution didn't believe their jury consultants and paid no attention to them. And as a result, they got a jury that was essentially picked by the defense and not by the prosecution. That's nullification. That's essentially saying, we don't care if he murdered her. We don't like the way he was treated by the cops. Plus, Furman is a racist. And, what do cops often do in the past? They fudge the evidence against black defendants. I think Dershowitz was right, not to join the defense, but in his conclusion. The jury thought the prosecution was trying to frame a guilty man. Go figure. Yeah.
So the prospect of serving on a jury, I've never really faced. It's partly because you hear a lot of educated people talking in a somewhat unappealing manner about how, they'll never be chosen to a jury. They can just say that we've got too much work, it would interrupt our life. So, is that true? And if that's the case, it resembles certain countries I know where there's mandatory military service, but, everyone who goes to college gets out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So something like that would further skew the composition of juries.
Yeah, again, there's a difference here between federal and state courts. I think federal courts are pretty impatient with those kind of excuses. Some state courts are more forgiving. I watched a trial, a jury being selected in a civil case in Middlesex County Court. I can't remember the judge's name. It was about 10 years ago. And he was very impatient with excuses. He would just say, there was a Harvard student who said, oh, this was in January. This is when you were still doing the finals in January. He said, I'm going to have a final exam. The judge said, tell me the name of your professor and I'll fix it up for you. Now, what happens next, however, is that kid gets removed by a peremptory challenge. Because why? He's really angry. And you don't want to, if you have an angry juror, he's going to take out his anger on somebody, but you just don't know who.
Or it's like the guy who wants to run home to dinner. He's not going to take the task seriously.
Yeah, right. Martha.
I have to leave almost immediately, but I actually know a little bit about this topic.
I know you do. And
Yes, and on the matter of jurors getting off easily, it's not easily any longer, at least in this state. And in fact, if you ignore a summons to serve on a jury, that's now a misdemeanor. You have to appear in court and answer to a charge.
But Massachusetts is one of the few states that really bothers to chase down those jurors. I mean, jury selection starts at the mailbox.
Yeah.
In some cities, Los Angeles, half the jury summons are ignored, and they don't go after them. Why? Because they don't want them.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Has the attitude to avoiding jury service always been present in America, or was it sometimes seen as like a privilege or?
Well, before public opinion surveys, there's no reliable data, but there are, anecdotally, yeah, there was in the late 19th century, I think this is when the idea that, oh, it's a burden, I don't want to do it, became much more widespread, which is why these professional associations would lobby the state legislatures for these exemptions. I don't think this was the view in the early 19th century, when the Republican jury was, so to speak, in full bloom.
Like in Tocqueville's time?
In Tocqueville's time, right. Yeah. There, I think serving on a jury was considered to be taking part in the government of the republic.
Is it related to the fact that the criterion of selection implied that you were a good person, a person of character, whereas now today it doesn't, so there's no privilege in it?
Maybe.
I don't know.
That's not a badge of accomplishment. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, is there a fear that if you're on a jury as a civilian, that afterwards you're going to get attacked or threatened? I mean, what's the percentage of people getting, restraining orders? And I mean, like the Whitey Bulger and stuff,
Right.
They show their faces. I mean, I think you have choices on whether you can show, but I mean, I would be fearful that someone would come after me, especially a criminal, would get his people even if he's in jail.
Well, here's what I learned. This is a serious problem, oddly, in Great Britain. Now, in Great Britain, jury trials, felony trials are for serious crimes. I mean, you got to kill somebody, right? So we're dealing with a population that is 100% dangerous. In the United States, not necessarily the case. And so it's now more and more common in England for juror names to be sequestered and jurors to be hidden. I mean, they go out the back door, they get into a panel van, they're guarded. That doesn't happen very much in the United States, but it's not unheard of. Gang retaliation in drug cases, for example, drug dealing cases, state cases. Sometimes witnesses are afraid and they won't testify, and sometimes the jurors are afraid too. Yeah.
So I was in journalism for 30 years, and I never covered courts as a beat, but I covered a lot of trials over the years, and long ones and short ones, and I was on one jury and excluded on a number of others. There wasn't one case that I ever saw where I didn't think the jury did a breathtakingly good job from what I saw as a reporter there. And I wondered do you know what judges think who see these day in and day out? What do they think about how good juries are.
Yeah, judges are among the defenders of the jury. On the other hand, a lot of judges don't get a chance to do many jury trials. But so for many of them, it's a kind of abstraction almost. But yeah, judges are quite convinced that when they see jury trials, they're happy with what they see, and they think the jury did a good job. Lawyers too, yeah.
So judges think that juries do a good job in spite of all the problems you have listed, picking of the jury by lawyers, the increasing complexity in
Right.
the law and commercial law, identity politics and the selection of jurors. Like,
Yeah.
So that seems to be at odds if you say, you know, we trust the judge's judgment because they judge, why would they come to that conclusion? So that was just a quick follow-up to that.
Right, yeah.
And my other question would be, from all the problems you have laid out, can you rank them in a way this is the gravest and so on, and suggest some things to address these problems? You just said, you know, you hope your book will spark discussion, but you must have your own thoughts about it.
Yeah, I think jury selection should be more under the control of the judges than the lawyers. I think jury commissions should spend more time interviewing prospective jurors. This will require a change in the law. It would require amending the Jury Selection and Service Act to permit jury commissioners to consider non-objective criteria, that's probably going to be a very hard thing to convince people of. So far, I haven't managed to convince very many people that that would be a good idea. I think the Congress would be reluctant to do it. And they would be reluctant to do it because of the fear that it would bring back the old subterfuge of using non-objective criteria as an excuse to racially segregate the jury system. I think that's less of a problem now than it was in the past. Now, but the question you ask that's an interesting question. Judges will say when they're asked, the juries that I have seen are most of the time do a good job. Not all the time, but most of the time. So how is that possible? Well, it could be that there have been some changes in the way judges can manage trials. More jurors are allowed to take notes. They're allowed to ask questions, which is something that they were never allowed to do in the past. Judges who appreciate juries are very careful in the way they talk to them and explain things to them. It's possible for people who sit on a jury reluctantly to actually learn something from that process. And if that's true, then that's evidence that Tocqueville was right, that this is in fact a kind of educational experience. And if the judges treat it that way and manage the jury with that in mind, Judge Young in Federal District Court does this very well in Boston. Then I think that might explain why people who were reluctant turn out to be pretty good jurors. Still, there are more hung juries. I mean, that's something that is countable, and more juries and more trials end with a jury that cannot come to a conclusion, cannot reach a verdict, and they get dismissed.
I have a question about the difference between conservatives and liberals over the question of law and order and how that affects jury. I can tell you an anecdote. A friend of mine was a professor out in California and was put on a murder trial, and, which started and proceeded for a day or two and then was called off because a plea bargain had taken place. And so the prosecutor came over to this juror and asked him how well he thought he had been doing, the prosecution. He just wanted to know how well his arguments had gone down. But before he spoke to him, the prosecutor said to him, "You're a Straussian, aren't you?" and my And his mouth was open, and he said, "Why is that relevant?" He says, "That's the only reason you're on the jury without a challenge."
Well, that's unexpected. Yeah. A University of Chicago law student, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who attended some lectures when he was in school. I'm sorry, I lost track of that question.
But well, the relevance of the dispute over
liberals and
law and
conservatives.
order, liberals and conservatives, yeah.
Yes, that would be something that would certainly come up in the context of a jury discussion. The discipline of the trial is meant to focus people's attention on things that they would not necessarily otherwise focus on, which is the evidence. And so there is a chance here for the evidence to outweigh the innuendos and the kind of atmosphere in which liberals and conservatives might discuss crime in the abstract. But if you have to pay attention to the evidence, here's the gun, here's the fingerprints, there's the body. It's not quite so abstract. But yes, the only jury I was on involved, it was a juvenile jury. It wasn't a serious crime. You know, the kid was accused of resisting arrest, causing a disturbance, assaulting a police officer. The assault was a tussle over the bike, which the police officer broke his finger. So, you know, the kid's not going to prison, but nevertheless, he's going to have a record. There was a woman from Brookline who was very kind, and there was a guy who grew up in a housing project in Chelsea, a Hispanic guy. And the judge made me the foreman. I actually said, hoping to get off, I'm writing a book on the jury system. So she appointed me the foreman. And I just had an instinct, because my right as a foreman to choose who gets to talk first, I thought it would be a good idea to let the Hispanic guy from the housing project speak first. So here's what he said. He said, you know what, I grew up in a place like this. This was a kid from a housing project, the defendant. And here's what I remember. When the cops came to arrest one of us, we had to give them a hard time. And they knew that. They knew that we were going to give them a hard time because we had no choice. You have to give them a hard time when they come to arrest one of your guys. So I don't have a hard time believing that this guy did what he did. Just an opinion. I wasn't asking for a vote. The woman from Brookline was just... Really? Yeah. Welcome to the real world. It's not Brookline. That's what can happen on a jury. That's why, multiplied by all the jury trials, that's a seminar. That's an education.
Did he get off?
No, we acquitted him of the charge of assaulting the police officer, but we convicted him of resisting arrest and causing a public disturbance, because it was likely that the broken finger was just an accident.
So I had a little different wrinkle on Harvey's question. I too was made foreman of the jury. I thought being a college professor, they would throw me, so they made me the foreman. But I yield to no one in my, I grew up in New York City. I love law and order. I mean, extreme. But you know, the judge made this big point about reasonable doubt. And I had to really rack my brain about what the guy was accused of. And there was a reason for that. It pushed me entirely against my convictions to vote not to convict this guy in that particular. It was another little charge with conviction. You know, it is powerful. Sitting there as a juror, Dennis elsewhere has written wonderful stuff about the office of citizenship. Also the office of being on a jury. He did turn my head.
Yeah, it's a task. It's a responsibility. It's not a right. Yeah.
Go away from my convictions.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if, just after those couple of stories, it does seem like people tend to rise to the occasion on juries.
Yes.
So it is a kind of aristocratic impulse to say that juries are filled with people who are unwise. But at least they know that they need to take this seriously.
Mhm.
And so it seems to me that they have a certain, maybe they know that they're unwise and they want to learn. And do you then see so you were saying the progressive impulse was actually against juries and for experts.
Experts, right.
So did that then change? Is that less now, or does that continue to get even worse? Do you foresee the jury sort of coming back do you see this as a way into appreciation of the jury as something that people can use to be educated, and then also as a certain kind of wisdom that's different from the wisdom of the expert?
Well, to know that there are things you don't know is, of course, the beginning of wisdom. So if you have a juror who is open to the idea, who's open to being convinced that even though he would love to throw this guy in jail, he can't do that now. That's not right. It's unjust. That's a kind of learning that happens inside the jury room, in part because the structure of the trial, Robert Burns has written about this, the structure of the trial is designed to privilege evidence and reason and argument over innuendo and emotion. I mean, you can never completely remove these things, but you can try to push them to the background. And then in the jury room, again, it depends on how well the jurors comport themselves. But people do rise to the occasion. They think about the evidence, they learn from the evidence, they change their minds. There's some statistical evidence that when juries start out with an 8-2 verdict, those 2 can change the other 8 quite often. But this is not the kind of experience that people have anywhere else. I mean, in the book I say this is one of the only places where deliberation is the rule rather than the exception. And it may actually be the only place, the court, not just the jury, but the court itself, the judicial system, where argument, reason, evidence, these things are privileged above everything else. Now, but the jury's not going to come back unless there's some attention given to the reasons that it has begun to vanish. The Supreme Court has ruled that in the Booker case that the sentencing guidelines cannot be mandatory; they can only be advisory. The court, this was one of Scalia's great decisions in the Apprendi case, has ruled that factors not proven to the jury cannot be used in a sentence. So this was a hate crime case. But he wasn't convicted of a hate crime. He was just convicted of firing a gun through the window of a house that had just been bought by a black family. The assumption clearly is, he wants to drive them away. Well, Scalia said, we call it a hate crime because it's a crime. So if you want to add another 20 years to this guy's sentence, the jury has to find him guilty of the hate crime. You can't just let the judge do that. You can't let the expert do that, right? Or you can't let the sentencing grid. A hate crime was considered a sentencing factor, right? Like brandishing a gun is a factor. So the hate crime has to be actually proven to the jury. Otherwise, it can't be part of the sentence. So there's some evidence that there's some pushback, but I have, every time I encounter somebody in the federal courts, I say you should try to get the Judicial Conference to reestablish its Committee on the Jury System, which they disbanded in the 1980s, and begin to think about how to bolster the jury, how to bring it back. They could probably make some suggestions. Yeah.
The anecdotal experiences discussed here seem largely encouraging, especially Harvey's story. But I wanted to ask you about an area where my own anecdotal experience was less encouraging, and that was with medical malpractice.
Yeah. Heartstrings.
Yes, in a huge business around creating judgments,
Right.
encouraging judgments that
Right.
are in excess of. So I wanted to ask your take on how this is and how it should be.
How it is how you describe it. How it should be, I don't know. Do we want to give this to experts? They'll decide what's a mistake and what's just an inevitable consequence of an uncertain science. They will decide, how much a death is worth, how much the death of a child is worth, how much the death of a 90-year-old is worth. They can do that. Okay. Is that better? We have, there's two competing goods here. I think the medical malpractice system, as it works itself out in the court, is almost certainly an enormous burden on the medical economy, right? Do we want to take those decisions away from juries? I'm not prepared to say that, but it is a problem. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it sounds like your primary concern is justice being done, and that with the decline or the vanishing jury, the question is, will justice still be done? The outcome of the trials would be the focus. Other times, it's the Tocquevillian concern that we're losing this Republican schoolhouse.
Right.
So I want to push you on the ladder on the Republican schoolhouse.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence that people really are educated by this? I can see how it's a simulacra of deliberation, like running a country or sailing a ship or something. But is there any evidence that on the other side, people come back from the experience and describe, like in education or sailing around the world on a ship or some other kind of experience, that they've genuinely been trained or more deliberative or have any real educative?
Yeah, there is evidence, but I'll admit up front that I'm not entirely certain I believe it, because it's survey evidence, and it's surveys at one particular time, like two or 3 years ago. We would want to see it over a longer period, but the evidence, for what it's worth, is encouraging. People who serve on juries say they have a much better impression of the judicial system than they had before. They really believe that it's fair, and they weren't certain of that before. They are proud of themselves. They feel that what they did, well, you used that term, rise to the occasion. That's exactly what they feel. They felt that they were challenged by something difficult, and they did a pretty good job, and that makes them feel good. They demonstrate evidence of a enhanced interest in public affairs through various measures. They say they read the newspapers more often, they watched the news more often, they even went to public talks more often, and they voted more often. So, maybe.
And you're skeptical of that?
Well, it's one survey, and I was so happy when I saw those results. And that's when you really have to, be careful. Yeah.
Yeah, just following up on that. Do you think juries are just good for, what you could call defective people? People that don't trust that the system is fair when in fact is. They aren't interested in public affairs. They have no sense of how to deliberate or deal with evidence fairly. So that you say, okay, the good thing about the jury system is it makes them more like political science professors, whereas science professors, they're already political science professors, so it would mostly be a waste of time for them. Or do you think, I mean, you give different answers.
Yeah, no. Anytime that people have an opportunity to learn how to deliberate and exercise judgment, it's good for them.
Yeah.
And because they're citizens, it's good for the country. Now, if it's only like 8 people every 2 years, that doesn't make any difference. There are 150,000 jury trials in the country every year. In 2004, 30% of Americans said that they had served on a jury at some point in their life. All right, that's getting into territory that is statistically significant in terms of leavening the population with people, citizens with some sense of the difficulties and the challenges of judgment and how to do it. I think if there were more opportunities for people to do that, I think that would probably, in the long run, be a good thing. It's not the only good thing, and it's not going to save us, but it's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that, because I too am skeptical of surveys, but I do believe the evidence that I've seen with my own eyes, and I have 2 family members that have served on juries, and I'm always struck by how vivid the experience is, even when it happened a long time ago. They can repeat it, and it did change them in some way. And one of the things I think is, perhaps it's the only institution where we're drafted, but we don't have to go into battle. So, and they make a sacrifice. They generally don't want to do it when they're going into it, but they make the sacrifice, and they feel as though they do a good job, and they learn something about their fellow citizens. And I think it really attaches them more to the country in a way that
I think so. And these days, it's probably the only place where you will actually spend time with people who are actually different from you in some significant way. They might not even be different in the ways that we pay a lot of attention to, gender, race, but they're going to be different in terms of their background, their social background, their experiences, their understanding of the world. Like this jury that I was on, this 6 people, housing project, Brookline. I mean, this is, where would those people have met?
Right.
Ever? And actually done something together. That has to make a difference, multiplied by 150,000 or whatever it is, the number is. That has to be a good thing.
Tocqueville indicates as an opinion that juries are especially valuable in democracies because democracies have the weakness that they tend to generalize too much. They overgeneralize, and this leads to too much legislation. The way that when something bad happens, everyone will say there ought to be a law. But when you're on a jury, you see that, as you were saying about the evidence, that the law often doesn't fit particular cases.
Yes.
And when you look at the individual circumstances of your case, it wises you up about the weakness of generalization in human affairs.
And it also teaches you, I think, something about justice, that there is no such thing as absolute justice. And sometimes things have to be adjusted somehow. Bob.
Can I say something more about what you call the structure of the jury system? Because although it's a democratic institution, it educates democratically, it educates because they're taught and they have to be there in a certain way. So what is it that makes, so to speak, a good, if not a good jury, then at least a good structure, a promising structure for this sort of thing?
Well, I think, first of all, there should be more care taken and I know this is an enormous burden because of the size of populations. Population is much bigger than it was in the 19th century, but some attention given to sorting the lists before they actually get into court. And as I said before, that's going to require some change in the law. That's the first thing. Second thing is the way in which jurors are instructed by the court about their responsibilities. Judges, it used to be always the case that judges would talk to jurors first. Now you get a video screen and, people fall asleep probably. But there is some way to explain to jurors what their job is, what to expect, what they're called upon to do, some effort to really get them ready for the possibility of actually being picked and seated on a jury. The structure of the trial, there was for a long time a movement to get judges to allow jurors to ask questions and take notes. Judges resisted this for literally a century and have finally now come around, many judges, to see that that's probably a good idea. If you take notes, you're less likely, first of all, to fall asleep. You're less likely to forget the sequence of events, and you're more likely to pay attention. And then to be able to ask questions. Not out loud, but write it, give it to the clerk. That happens more often now. And it helps, I think, the jury understand some of the somewhat arcane things that are going on. Another trial I witnessed, this was Judge Young's court. He admonished one of the lawyers about asking leading questions. And a juror wrote a note because she didn't understand what that meant, leading questions. So he just said, when she asks a question in a way that's meant to get just the answer she wants, that's a leading question, and she's not allowed to do that. Well, that's a good, clear explanation, right? Now the juror understands, first of all, what that means, and also that there's a kind of struggle going on in the court, and the judge is the one who's supposed to try to keep the rules in force. I mean, does that, am I getting at your question right, in the right way?
Yeah. I suppose it's partly the underlying structure, and it's partly the special conduct of, say, a Judge Young.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, judges are important in this. I know.
Why are there more hung juries today? What are the reasons for that? And that experience of a hung jury would not seem to lead to, the greater fostering understanding of those people, but you go out there and you just want to shoot everybody who disagree with you and let that guy off or something. It reinforces all the whatever prejudices you have.
Well, the increase in hung juries is a sign of a problem with the public. You go to war with the army you got. That's what Rumsfeld said. You go to court with the population you've got, not the population you want. But this is a sign that there has been some degradation in public virtue.
In what way? How so?
A refusal to assign responsibility for actions. A refusal to believe in the sanctity of the law. These are virtues, and they may have disappeared in many parts of the country, many parts of the population.
But I would have to ask, can there be legitimate disagreement in the jury? Is it always clear in the end where it should end?
No. As to what the verdict should be, no, there can always be legitimate disagreement about what the verdict should be.
Yes.
What hung juries normally reflect is a refusal on the part of one or two jurors to accept the evidence or to believe that the crime should be a crime. Hung juries happen sometimes, for example, in drug cases or sexual assault cases, oddly enough. There's, not surprisingly, a lot of men with broad understandings of what constitutes permissible sexual conduct, right? And those people will just not convict. The evidence is clear, you know, the defendant did this thing, but I'm not going to vote to convict him because I don't think this thing actually is wrong. Whether this thing is, you know, rape or smoking pot or selling drugs. So that's typically the kind of cases that result in hung juries.
I didn't understand why jurors couldn't take notes. What was the reason for that?
The reason was that they would get lost in the minutia of the trial. And that's not an unreasonable possibility, but yeah.
Well, Dennis, this has been an extremely interesting presentation.
Good,
And with your wonderful answers, you've exhausted us. And we want to thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Of the court, even if this meant, especially if this meant, opposition to the government itself. This belief was the spark that ignited the movement for a Bill of Rights and was ultimately responsible for 3 of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In fact, from the very earliest settlements in British America, the jury had been an important political institution with many more functions than simply rendering verdicts. Colonial juries inquired into the conduct of public officials and the management of public property, and they determined fair compensation for property taken in eminent domain proceedings. They were an essential part of an evolving Republican regime in which the popular voice was understood to belong in the judiciary as well as in the legislature. Indeed, the jury was often described as the lower house of the judiciary. And as state governments became more democratic, with easier suffrage and citizenship requirements, the American jury became what it was when Tocqueville encountered it, the majority vested with the right to pronounce decrees. It had also acquired by Tocqueville's time an additional purpose, educator of democratic citizens. Tocqueville's is the most famous argument along these lines, but Tocqueville was not alone in seeing both the need for such education and the possibility that jury service might be an important way to provide it. And here the jury comes close to revealing the democratic paradox in crystalline form. Only the wise are capable of judging rightly, but only those who have experience at judging can learn the wisdom that judging requires. Tocqueville was prepared to accept one of the logical conclusions of this paradox, at least in the case of civil trials, that while the jury system might not be useful for those who have lawsuits, it is very useful for those who judge them. I regard it as one of the most efficacious means society can make use of for the education of the people. To see the jury as a free school always open, that's how Tocqueville described it, implies a certain relationship between jurors and judges. Acting as Republican schoolmasters, judges often saw themselves as the senior partners in a common enterprise where both the judge and the jury are sworn to understand and apply the law together. This meant that jurors had the authority, perhaps even the duty, to find or judge the law for themselves, always with the understanding that they should pay due respect to the opinion of the court. This was not only the view of jurors, it was also the view of judges. In one of the few Supreme Court cases tried to a jury, Chief Justice John Jay, in his jury charge, had this to say. This is Georgia v. Brailsford from 1794. It may not be amiss here, gentlemen, to remind you of the good old rule that on questions of fact, it is the province of the jury. On questions of law, it is the province of the court to decide. But it must be observed that you have nevertheless a right to take upon yourselves to judge of both and to determine the law as well as the fact in controversy. We have no doubt you will pay that respect which is due to the opinion of the court, but still, both objects are lawfully within your power of decision. Throughout the 19th century, this good old rule that jurors and judges were partners rather than rivals, and that citizens who made the law could also understand the law, was the underlying assumption guiding the conduct of civil and criminal trials in both state and federal courts. An essential part of that view, however, was the understanding that jurors would have to possess the particular qualities that make sound judgment possible. These qualities were described in state jury statutes variously as intelligence, character, reputation, integrity, or common sense. And jury commissioners were authorized to find such citizens using whatever means they thought most effective. By contrast with voting, a right available early in the century to white males with even small amounts of property and eventually no property at all, jury service was a responsibility rather than a right, a difficult responsibility on which the fate of defendants and litigants rested, making it all the more important to find those citizens who were most likely to give adequate service. Here is Tocqueville again commenting on state jury laws in the early 19th century. While the right to serve on a jury extends to everyone, the exercise of this right is not put indiscriminately in all hands. Those who are chosen are those citizens supposed by the magistrate, whose powers were extensive and quite arbitrary, to have the requisite qualities for service. It was not unusual, therefore, for a state to have more voters than jurors. One aim of these arbitrary powers was to keep from the jury those characters the lawyers sometimes refer to as pudding heads. I don't think I need to translate that, right? This phrase appears in John Adams' legal diary as early as the 1760s, a time when only males with substantial property holdings and had full civic rights, meaning that even among the community's most elite members, on our beverage, but it will have to do.
Yeah, we don't have water.
That's what I thought. The democratic paradox is easily stated. In a democracy, ruling a task requiring wisdom is open in principle to all applicants and in practice to many who are not in the least bit wise. The focus of this book and this talk is a small sample of this paradox at work, the American jury, which places some of the weightiest questions facing society into the hands of 12 people plucked from the civic mass. The jury's verdict might send defendants home or to prison or to death row, or the jury might transfer money, sometimes lots of it, from one litigant to another. Jurors may do these things well or badly, but their decisions are usually final, and in criminal cases, a jury's acquittal is always final. That such a system has lasted so long is often the subject of wonder and sometimes scorn among foreign observers of American law, but sometimes, and not only recently, among natives as well. Understanding the jury is therefore a way to understand democracy itself, with its triumphs as well as its failures. Yet in the beginning, the jury was not a democratic institution at all. It was simply a way for the English monarch to acquire vital information that only local subjects could be expected to possess. Its gradual evolution from a tool of kings to a champion of the people's rights is part of the long story of the emergence of republican institutions in England. That evolution left an important mark on Americans, persuading them that a free government was one in which the public could participate directly in the legal system as full partners of.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is Dennis Hale, who's a professor of political science at Boston College. He did his undergraduate work at Oberlin College and got a PhD in political science from the City University of New York in the graduate center there. And he's been teaching at Boston College since 1978. He has been there, the department chair there, and also has been director of undergraduate studies and of the honors program. And he does a lot of teaching in both to graduate students and to freshmen, introducing American politics, and speaking on the American founding. With Mark Landy, who's also here, he's edited 2 volumes of essays by Bertrand de Jouvenel, French political philosopher, and he's written a number of articles on local government, American political thought, public administration, which have appeared in all the various important professional journals. But he's now published, just this year, a real tome, an accomplishment, a work of scholarship that it's all too rare, and he deserves to be congratulated. And the book is called "The Jury in America: Triumph and Decline." So Dennis Hale is going to say something about this book, and he'll answer any question that you raise.
I'll try. I'll try. Can you hear me? Is this working? All right? Great. This is not my normal seminar.